seeing Rex and Steve up here reminded me of those two old men from the Muppets. Remember those guys? They used to sit up there in the balcony, and they would, yeah. So we are blessed, as you know, all weekend long to have Scott Patchen with us, and there is no authority higher than he, now living. Maybe a veteran of this battle might know something that he doesn't, but beyond that, he is the go-to source for the National Historic District and the Civil War community as a whole when it comes to many of the battles in Virginia, especially in the Shenandoah Valley, and most especially here at Third Winchester. His book is so hard to keep on our shelves, we almost just want to stop selling because we spend so much staff time trying to find the damn thing. They fly off the shelf. It's the authority on this battle. He's a dear friend of battlefield preservation, a dear friend of mine, and I'd like to introduce him to you now.
Well, first of all, it's a great honor to be out here, and my primary contact with this has been through Rex. And I remember a few years ago, I myself am a native of Cleveland, Ohio, and long followed the Ohio troops in the campaigns in the Shenandoah Valley. And I get very excited to listen to Rex's vision and all the work that you and Steve have done on this to bring this through to fruition. I think it's just incredible. And, you know, it's something I thought about it. These Ohioans somewhere in this valley out here, for all the Ohioans that were out here, something needed to be done at some point. So I personally thank both of you for all your efforts, and Mike for all your labors out here as well. Now, I'm going to back up a little bit. You know, why are we out here on September 19th of 1864 recalling this battle that these Ohioans and 30,000 other Northerners primarily, why were they here? In the summer of 1864, one of the most important things that's happening is the re-election campaign for Abraham Lincoln. You know, if Abraham Lincoln doesn't get re-elected that fall, whatever's happening on the battlefields could all be for naught, because the Democratic platform is running against him for a negotiated peace. We're tired of the casualties. We want peace. We will let them go, let the South go and have its way. Things were not looking good in the summer of 1864. Grant and Meade's campaign with the Army of the Potomac against Lee starting in May in the Battle of the Wilderness is going to lose 55,000 men just through the first month of the campaign, let alone what happens in June and July. That's empty chairs in every household throughout the states in the Union at the time. And things were not going well. And at a very time, and especially the month of July of 1864, we look at the situation. Grant's supposed to be closing in and capturing Richmond and defeating Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. But what has actually happened is that on July 11th, the Confederate Army of 17,000 men shows up at the very doorstep of Washington, D.C. before reinforcements from Grant arrive at the last minute to shut the door and prevent the fall of the United States Capitol. By the end of the month, on July 30th, two more disasters occur. Confederate forces launch a retaliatory raid into southern Pennsylvania and burn Chambersburg, Pennsylvania to the ground. Same day is the disastrous Battle of the Crater in Petersburg, with thousands of men lost, one of the first major engagements that African American troops were involved in during the Civil War. Things are looking so bad that by the middle of August, General Henry Halleck, who was the chief of staff, largely an advisory position to President Abraham Lincoln, tells Grant it's time to bring in the sails a little bit and slow down. Hopefully Sherman can accomplish something positive in Georgia, but we've got to stop having these disasters, things that look to the electorate as if not only are we not winning, but we are not losing. We have to remember that the immense casualties throughout the war that occur in Virginia occur for a reason. The two national capitals sit about 100 miles apart in Washington and Richmond. And regardless of what's happening, the North has to win in Virginia to truly defeat the Confederacy. It does not look like that's going to happen. And on August 22nd, Lincoln writes out a memorandum before a cabinet meeting. And essentially what he says in this memorandum, it says, "It looks exceedingly probable that I will not be reelected. Therefore, it will be my duty to achieve victory between the election in November and the following March of 1865, that they didn't swear the president in until March back in that day, to win the war while I am still in office, because my successor will be elected under such grounds that by the time he is sworn in, he will be politically unable to continue to prosecute the war." And he's going to ask each member of his cabinet to sign this. Now, he's going to have it folded over so they can't see what it says. He's asking them to promise their support for him on August 22nd. Of course they all do, and they don't know what this says. But that shows you where President Abraham Lincoln himself was in August. Out here in the Shenandoah Valley, we're going to begin to see changes taking place. September 1st, of course, Atlanta would fall. But in Virginia, there is nothing but a long list of casualties. Going back throughout, we look at the Eastern Theater. There was the standoff at Antietam and a defensive victory at Gettysburg, which tended to be, up until this point in 1864, the highlights of the Union. Things looked in May at the Battle of Wilderness on the 6th as if they were going to smash the Army of Northern Virginia when Longstreet shows up in counterattacks. It looks on May 12th at Spotsylvania as if they may finally crush the Army of Northern Virginia, but Robert E. Lee and his men would hold out and stem the tide of a massive Union breakthrough. So, even though Lee's falling back, he's doing so at a tremendous cost, and things need to change. Grant is going to appoint General Philip Henry Sheridan. Grant, by the way, a native of Southwest Ohio, and Phil Sheridan, who his origins of birth are Ireland, Boston, Albany, New York. We know he was not born in Ohio, but he was brought to Ohio as an 18-month-old baby and grew up in Somerset, Ohio. And it's going to be these two Ohioans and their strategy and tactics in August that are going to result in the ensuing battle on September 19th of 1864. Sheridan comes out in early August. He starts moving southward. He's only got about 25,000 men at this point. All of his reinforcements have not arrived. He's going to be as far south as Strasburg when he gets word from General Grant that 6,000 Confederate reinforcements have just joined Jubal Early. You need to fall back towards Harper's Ferry. This is in result of that advice from Halleck. We've got to avoid disaster. And so he falls back towards Harper's Ferry. And there's going to be jokes that, well, what's Sheridan doing? Because from the middle of August until the middle of September, there's not a lot of activity. But what has happened there is Grant kind of put the leash on Sheridan and told him, we're going to hold back. We need to make sure that those reinforcements go back to Richmond. Then we know you'll have an advantage of numbers and you can attack. And that's exactly what the plan would be. Sheridan and Grant would be patient. Atlanta would fall. Lincoln would actually be corresponding with Grant, say, hey, can't we grab a regiment from here and there and over there to the tune of, say, 10,000 men and send them to Sheridan, and then we can attack at Winchester. Well, ironically, right about that time, and where Grant's starting to get a little worried and think maybe we've got to come up with a more definitive plan than just waiting, Sheridan's intelligence out here in the Shenandoah Valley, which he got from an Ohioan, Colonel Benjamin Franklin Coates, whose family had been Quakers that had left Winchester a generation before he was born. And through some of his family connections, they learned that that division that had come up here under Joe Kershaw departed on September 15th. Grant would arrive in Charlestown the next day, and the two Buckeyes there would meet. Sheridan brings his plan of battle for attacking Jubal Early at Winchester, and Grant looked at it, and Grant, who had his own plan in his pocket, wrote, "It never left my pocket, and they were the easiest orders that I ever had to give. I simply told him to go in." And go in he would on September 19th. Now, over in that direction, a few miles in that direction, down Route 7, where Opeckin Creek crisscrosses the road, is where the battle would start off. Buckeyes of the 2nd Ohio Cavalry, just primarily in the area up in northeast Ohio, is where most of the men form in what's now the Cleveland area, all the way over towards the Pennsylvania, with the scattering men from Cincinnati, Columbus, and other parts of the state as well. They will be amongst the vanguard under General McIntosh, splashing across the creek, driving back the Confederate cavalry, charging up the Berryville Canyon toward the present high school over there. And there they would withstand, with their comrades from New York and Pennsylvania, vicious counterattacks from Stephen D. Ramseur's North Carolina infantrymen. But they would hold the line so that the United States 6th Army Corps could come up and deploy for action. Sheridan would follow them onto the field. He would ride up behind McIntosh, pat him on the shoulder, and tell him, "Well done, sir, well done." Where he had secured the critical high ground, and he did not, and Sheridan's army would not be bottled up and inside the canyon. So the 6th Army Corps will come up and deploy. It'll be followed by the 19th Army Corps. And by 11:40 a.m., Sheridan's attack is ready to roll. Now, prominent amongst those in the first attack were about 1,200 Ohioans in the 6th Corps. They were fighting along the axis of Route 7 and heading east to west. They were under the command of a colonel, Colonel Joseph Warren Keifer. Keifer is an interesting guy. He writes a book after the war, a 2-volume detailed history called Slavery in 4 Years of War. It's one of the best memoirs I've ever read, and he provides lots of detail on his military experience that you don't see elsewhere. So Keifer's men are going to move forward. They're going to be involved in the initial attack, and they'll take some heavy casualties, but ultimately they're going to be temporarily successful in driving Ramseur's division back toward Interstate 81, and they're fleeing towards Winchester when things are going to go south. A gap develops in the middle of the Union line. And some soldiers from Alabama, we dedicated a monument to out here a few years back, over at the other side of Red Bud Run behind you, counterattacked into that gap. And most of the gains that Sheridan's troops had made that morning are going to be lost. They would hold the line, however, and hold a couple hundred yards from their original starting point. It's then that General Phil Sheridan is going to turn to another Ohio native, Major General George Crook. He's actually turns to Crook before things had gone south up there, and he's going to have Crook moving his troops forward. And he's going to have him come forward over here on what is the northern flank, or the right flank of the Union Army. The 19th Corps in the fields behind you has been roughly handled, and it's going to be a brave stand of some stoic New Englanders in the middle field that would hold the line and prevent a Confederate breakthrough in the early and mid-afternoon. They would hold that line until Crook comes up. George Crook marches up behind the 19th Corps, leaves his men in position in the woods, comes all the way up to the Red Bud Run, probably about 500 yards off in that direction. He's trying to ensure where he's at on the battlefield, because his orders are to go in on the right flank, and Crook was going to make damn well sure that that's where he was. He looks up, he sees an officer, a main officer from the 19th Corps, and he says, "Is this the right flank of the Army?" He gets an uncertain answer, and he says, "I need to know if this is the right flank of the Army, because I'm to go in on the right." And the officer who's up in the tree looks out, scours these fields, which were much more open at the time because of the farming that was going on, and says, yep, this is it. And sure, this is it. You didn't see anybody over here. Fortunately for Crook, the Confederate cavalry that had been here has already begun pulling back because of Union cavalry moving down the Valley Pike well to the north and west of us. So Crook is going to come up with a plan of attack. And let me back up here. While he's doing that, Sheridan has ridden along the line of battle. He's gotten nervous. He's like, you know what? This is my first major action as an independent commander. And I'm paraphrasing what's going on in his mind. He's saying, I got to get over there to the point of contact where everything's going down. So he gets over here, and before Crook's men get up and take over the front lines, he gets over there. The commander of the 19th Army Corps is ready to cover a retreat. He's very shaken. Of course, he's lost 2,000 men in the woods across the Red Bud Run from where we stand right now. And he believes that, the Army needs to cut its losses and fight again another day. But Sheridan tells them, he says, man, you've not begun to fight yet. I've got Crook on his way up here with 10,000 men, and we're going to whip these fellows as they've never been whipped before. Now, Crook only had about 6,000 men with him, but the point is well taken. And it's a point that many of the officers, the combat officers and lower ranking brigade and division commanders under General Emory took heart of, and some nice journal stories and accounts of that going on. So those troops are going to hold on. Crook then is going to develop a plan. He's going to have one of his divisions under another Ohio, at least he's generally associated with West Virginia, Colonel Joseph Thoburn. He was born in the north of Ireland and grew up in St. Clairsville, Ohio. And he would ultimately, right before the late 1850s, move to Wheeling, West Virginia. And he would rise through the ranks and fight in the Shenandoah Valley campaigns in 1862 and 64. His division would remain on the southern bank of Red Bud Run, which is right behind you. And I encourage all of you, if you've not already gone over there, to look over there and look down and see the Red Bud Run. It's a pretty impressive sight, especially if you listen to the stories of what happens around there. Thoburn's men are going to be attacking on that side. They get orders that when they hear the charge of Crook and the rest of Crook's little force, which was called the Army of West Virginia, on this side of the creek, that they were to charge forward and attack the Confederates on the south bank. Crook would meanwhile lead his other division forward here. In that second division that's attacking on our side of Red Bud Run were a couple of prominent Ohioans that some of you might have heard of. The first is Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes, commander of the 1st Brigade of Infantry of Crook's 2nd Infantry Division. Hayes has fought out here in Western Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley from May through here. His men have seen heavy combat and even heavier marching out of the mountains of West Virginia down towards the Blacksburg-Radford area in May, and then returning back to West Virginia. In June, the next month, they marched out of the mountains from West Virginia to Stanton. These guys had done so much marching, these guys being all of Crook's men, they had the nickname by the end of the summer as the Mountain Creepers, because of all the marching they did through the mountains, or more simply, the Buzzards, because they did a lot of this marching with little to no rations at the time. And about half of Crook's force is Ohioans. So on this side, you not only have Hayes, but you have a second future president. Captain William McKinley, in his early 20s, is a staff officer for General George Crook. At one point, he's carrying orders back to Thoburn, from what is expected of him when Crook's over here. Well, Crook's men are going to come across the ground over here, charging down towards the Red Bud Run. As they do so, as they start coming across the high ground over there, John B. Gordon's Confederates on the high ground on the south bank see him, and they start turning their artillery fire. And as one of Rutherford B. Hayes' staff officers noted, everything on the Confederate left was turned against us. interesting story. A relic hunter told me one time he had found all kinds of shot and shell embedded into this hillside over here where the Confederate artillerists were pounding Crook's men as they charged here. Now they're going to charge down, and although that's quite overgrown there today, if you had come here in 1864, it was even more overgrown. There was no trail going down. There was briar, thorns, and all sorts of things. So when Hayes is leading his men down there, they have no idea. Redbud Run behind you is a swamp that's about 60 yards wide. Where they crossed Redbud Run about 1.5 miles downstream from us, they didn't even mention crossing it. It was just a stream that the men were probably, if they got their ankles wet, that's how deep it was. So they're not expecting this. They go down there. The briar completely disorganizes them. So they're charging down there. They get to the bank. Everybody stops. Of course, these neat battle line formations that they had to come across this field are going to be completely disrupted by the dense undergrowth. Rutherford B. Hayes sees some action is needed. He's going to get on his horse and he's going to start going across that swamp. He's going to get about halfway across, and his horse's hoofs are going to get caught in the mud and silt that had built up along the bottom. So Hayes is going to dismount, and again, the direct fire here was not that heavy because you had Thoburn attacking from that direction. So Gordon's men, fortunately, are fighting against Thoburn, who's coming at them from the front. And there's a scattering fire across the creek. And Hayes gets across, and it's incredible, his story of this that he writes at home a few days later in a letter to his wife, and sits down on a rock and pours the water out of his boots. And there was one other man that he saw who had made it across at the same time as him. And he would spend years after he had retired from the presidency in the late 1800s writing letters to other soldiers who had served in his command, trying to find out who that man was. Well, at this point in the battle, the troops of his old regiment, the 23rd Ohio, were following Hayes across the swamp. Crook and some other officers led the larger majority, about 500 yards up in that direction, where the water was a little shallower and the creek narrower in front of Hatwood Plantation, and they would start attacking in that direction. These Ohioans would include the 91st Ohio. I know we have, you raise your hand, I would say he's a descendant and his ancestor was wounded here in this battle, in this attack. And they would charge across the ground, the 91st Ohio and the 34th Ohio Battalion, and together with the 36th Ohio and the 23rd Ohio charging in from this direction. And all the Virginians under Colonel George Patton around the Hatwood Plantation would be driven back in confusion toward Winchester. Gordon's division, with this pressure here and Thoburn in the front, it's going to crack. It's going to begin falling back. So Early's entire battle line is falling back from this position all the way down about 2 miles to Route 7 or the Berryville Pike. Now, Phil Sheridan didn't stay up here. As soon as he saw Crook's action was underway, he starts riding along behind the battle lines. As he gets down closer to Route 7, he is actually out on the skirmish line. And he gets in amongst some Ohioans of the Joseph Ward Kiefer's brigade, the 110th, the 126th, and another regiment were there. And they start cheering for him, for Sheridan. Sheridan then would ride amongst some Pennsylvanians. And he's stealing the men. You know, the 6th Corps is beginning to advance, but they're coming under a heavy artillery fire. Some of the men, the attack is stalling as it's moving out of the woods into the open ground. Suddenly, one Pennsylvanian wrote that suddenly Sheridan appeared in our midst. And he yells out, "Come on, boys. The only way to do it is to kill every son of a bitch." And, then this officer, he wrote this letter the day after the battle, so it's not like a memoir that he wrote 40 years later. He said, and he was cussing the whole time, and the most amazing thing to the men was Sheridan was smiling the whole time. He was in his element here. Sheridan has the reputation as the vaunted cavalry commander because of the accomplishments of his cavalry in the valley and during the Appomattox campaign. But I submit to you that this is a man who made his reputation as an infantry division commander in the Army of the Cumberland for a couple of years, and that is where he was most comfortable. You would see it again at Fisher's Hill, and you would see it again along the Rhines of Cedar Creek. Was Phil Sheridan out there with the foot soldiers. So they're driving everything towards Winchester. Yeah. And we're going to have some more Ohioans come in. And I'd also like to mention here is that there's several regiments in the cavalry that are going to be charging down from Martinsburg Pike towards Winchester in the United States Regulars. And I know of at least one officer from the 2nd United States who was an Ohioan, and there were certainly other detachments, men who had enlisted in the United States Regular Army in those cavalry units, and a couple of the artillery batteries that were accompanying them. So that cavalry is going to be charging down, and amongst them, over on the opposite side, the west side of Route 11, is going to be the 8th Ohio Cavalry. And this whole, as Crook is driving everything back in that direction towards Winchester, we've got this cavalry coming down southward. Now there's one other prominent Ohioan who is leading cavalry there. I hesitate to mention it because he defected to Michigan. You know how Buckeyes feel about those Wolverines. But there was George Armstrong Custer, native of Ohio, leading the Michigan Brigade, spearheading a lot of these charges into the midst of the retreating Confederates. And I think there's a lot of controversy, you know, oh, did the infantry do it or did the cavalry do it? But as Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes would write, he said it was proper action on the part of both. That when it looked as if the Confederates might rally and stop the infantry, the cavalry came up and joined the action. And it was through perfect teamwork that they were able to achieve this victory here. Now Sheridan Army would send early whirling through Winchester by the end of the day. The 2nd Ohio Cavalry, a part of Wilson's cavalry division, would be amongst the last troops engaged. They would be conducting the pursuit south of Winchester, and the 2nd Ohio Cavalry would be among the last to charge, and they attacking a Confederate rear guard posted behind a stone wall at Kernstown. There we will be on Saturday as part of our tour. Sheridan would lose 5,000 men, inflicting 4,000 casualties on the Confederates. But it's important to step back to the big picture now, where things were going so awful in Virginia, and there seemed to be no tangible signs of success. The Third Battle of Winchester, or more appropriately, as the Union guys call it, the Battle of Opequon, or Opequon Creek, as most of them would have emblazoned upon their battle flags after having fought this hard-earned victory here on September 19th, 1864. This battle changes. It's clear as a historian looking back that the Army of Northern Virginia, including Jubal Early, which he was the 2nd Corps Army of Northern Virginia out here, and Sheridan mostly was largely a detachment from the Army of the Potomac. It's clear that, yes, they're winding down, but politically with that election coming up, they needed some tangible signs of victory. And it's as one officer wrote about the Confederates who were trounced at Third Winchester, he wrote, for once in their lives, they know they are licked. Yes, literally skinned alive. And these several thousand Ohioans lose 500 to 600 men killed and wounded in battle here on September 19th as part of that effort. And I just will echo again the sentiments of Kevin and Steve and Rex, as to how appropriate this is. And for me personally, I just love this Red Bud Run approach here. And you had your highest concentration of Ohioans coming right through with Crook from that direction, and Hayes and with Thoburn just across on the other side of the creek. This is a wonderful location, Kevin, and it's highly visible. as people are coming up out from the other side or whether they're coming from the visitor side. So I just want to thank everyone for putting this monument here and everything that you all have done to make this happen. So, thank you all.